October 26, 1937. Shanghai is burning. 3 months of street-to-street fighting have turned China's largest city into a graveyard of rubble and bodies. Japanese forces, over 200,000 troops backed by tanks, planes, and naval guns, have pushed the Chinese defenders back mile by mile. Casualties number in the hundreds of thousands. The Chinese National Revolutionary Army, under Chiang Kai-shek, is collapsing. Outnumbered, outgunned, low on supplies, they face annihilation. Chiang knows the city is lost, but he needs time for a full retreat of his remaining 300,000 men westward. He orders a final, desperate stand to tie down the Japanese and show the world China won't surrender quietly. The Battle of Shanghai started on August 13, 1937, when Japanese Marines landed and advanced into the city. It was supposed to be a quick victory for Japan, but the Chinese fought with everything they had: rifles, machine guns, homemade grenades, even swords in close quarters. The fighting spread through factories, streets, and apartments. Japanese bombers leveled entire districts. By late October, the Chinese lines cracked. Chiang's retreat plan was to pull back to Nanjing, but he needed a distraction. He chose a small force to hold a position that would force the Japanese to commit troops and resources, buying precious days. That position was the Sihang Warehouse, a massive concrete structure on the north bank of Suzhou Creek, right next to the international settlement, where foreign powers like Britain, France, and the US had concessions. Built in 1931 as a bank storage facility, it was 60 meters long, 50 meters wide, and 6 stories high, with thick reinforced concrete walls designed to withstand earthquakes. The location was perfect, backed by the creek, which acted as a natural barrier, and overlooked by buildings in the settlement where journalists and civilians could watch. It had limited access points, allowing defenders to funnel attacks into kill zones. Supplies inside included food, water, and ammunition stockpiled earlier. Chiang knew the Japanese couldn't bomb it heavily without risking an international incident. The warehouse's defensive advantages were clear. Its walls could resist artillery shells. The high floors allowed snipers and machine gunners to cover approaches, and the urban terrain limited Japanese tank use. It was a fortress in the middle of a city, chosen not just for survival, but for symbolism to show the world China's defiance. The commander of that small force was Lieutenant Colonel Xie Jinyuan, a 33-year-old officer from Guangdong province who had trained at the Whampoa Military Academy under Chiang Kai-shek himself. Xie led the 1st Battalion of the 524th Regiment, 88th Division, a unit of just 423 combat-effective men, mostly young recruits from Guangdong and Hunan. They were ordered to hold the warehouse no matter what, to buy time for the main army's retreat. Xie knew the odds. His men were surrounded, low on heavy weapons, facing a Japanese division of over 20,000 troops. But he also knew the power of symbolism. To confuse the enemy and inspire the Chinese public, Xie spread the word that 800 soldiers were defending the position. It was a deliberate lie, a propaganda myth that stuck. Newspapers in the international settlement picked it up, calling them the 800 heroes. The Japanese believed it too, committing more forces than needed, thinking they faced a full regiment. Inside the warehouse, preparations began immediately. The building's concrete walls were thick up to a meter, in places designed to store bank valuables, not hold off an army. The men barricaded doors and windows with sandbags scavenged from the site, creating firing slits for rifles and machine guns. They stocked ammunition in key positions, rationed the canned food and water already stored there, and set up aid stations for the wounded. Xie divided the floor's ground level for defense, upper stories for snipers overlooking the approaches. They rigged tripwires for grenades on the perimeter and prepared to fight room by room if the Japanese breached. No one expected to survive long, but the setup turned the warehouse into a fortress that could bleed the attackers for days. The fighting began almost immediately after the Chinese flag was raised on the roof. On October 27, the Japanese 3rd Division launched their first major assault. Artillery shells hammered the warehouse walls, but the thick concrete held craters formed. Dust filled the air, but no breach. Machine guns from the upper floors raked the open ground in front, cutting down waves of infantry. Japanese soldiers tried to rush the entrances with bayonets fixed. The defenders waited until they were close, then opened fire from slits and windows. Grenades rolled down the steps, exploding among the attackers. By nightfall, the Japanese had suffered over 100 casualties with nothing to show for it. The warehouse stood untouched. October 28 brought heavier bombardment. Japanese 75mm field guns and naval fire from the Huangpu River pounded the building for hours. Smoke and flame rose from the roof, but the defenders extinguished fires with buckets of water stored inside. Snipers on the 6th floor picked off officers and machine gunners across Suzhou Creek. When Japanese troops tried to cross the creek in boats under cover of darkness, Chinese machine guns swept the water boats overturned. Men drowned or were shot. The attackers retreated again. Inside, the defenders rationed water and ammunition, bandaging wounds with torn cloth, sharing cigarettes when they could. Morale held because they could see the lights of the international settlement across the creek, safety just 200 meters away, yet impossibly far. By October 29th and 30th, the Japanese grew desperate. They brought in more artillery and tried flamethrowers to burn the defenders out. Flames licked at the lower floors, but the men fell back to upper levels and kept firing. Japanese infantry assaulted again in daylight, supported by tanks, but the narrow streets limited armor movement. The defenders dropped grenades from windows and held the ground floor. Casualties mounted on both sides, Japanese dead piled up in the open, Chinese wounded treated in makeshift aid posts on the upper floors. The warehouse shook with each shell, but it did not fall. Across Suzhou Creek, in the international settlement, thousands watched from rooftops, hotel balconies, and the Bunte Western journalists, diplomats, and civilians had a front row seat to the battle. Photographers captured images of the Chinese flag still flying, smoke rising from the warehouse, Japanese shells bursting against its walls. Newspapers in Shanghai, London, and New York ran headlines. China's Alamo, 800 heroes hold out. Foreigners cheered when Chinese machine guns answered Japanese fire. The visibility forced the Japanese to fight carefully, no heavy bombing that might hit the settlement and provoke international outrage. The defenders knew this. They fought harder, knowing the world was watching. The fighting dragged on into November 1st. Japanese assaults had grown more desperate. Flamethrowers burned the lower floors. Artillery shells cracked the concrete, and infantry tried to scale the walls with ladders. The defenders held every floor, falling back only when forced, using the stairwells and corridors as kill zones. Ammunition was running low. Men shared the last clips, rationed grenades, and fought with bayonets and bricks when rifles emptied. Wounded were carried to the upper stories, bandaged with torn uniforms, given what little morphine remained. Xie Jinyuan moved constantly between floors, directing fire, encouraging the men, refusing to leave his post even as shells shook the building. That evening, word came from Chiang Kai-shek himself. The main army had completed its retreat. The stand had served its purpose. Xie was ordered to withdraw. The plan was daring cross Suzhou Creek under cover of darkness into the international settlement, where foreign powers would not allow Japanese pursuit. At 10 p.m., the defenders began slipping out the back. They moved in small groups, crawling through rubble, using the creek's bank as cover. Japanese sentries fired sporadically, but the night was thick with fog and smoke. One by one, the men waded or swam the creek, some supporting wounded comrades. Foreign observers on the south bank watched through binoculars, some cheering quietly as the Chinese reached safety. By dawn, all who could move had crossed. Xie Jinyuan was among the last. The warehouse stood silent, flags still flying, but empty. Japanese troops rushed in to find only bloodstains, spent cartridges, and a few dead defenders who had stayed behind to cover the escape. The 800 heroes had vanished into the settlement. The Japanese claimed victory, but the world press reported the escape as a masterstroke. China's army had held, fought, and lived to fight again. The myth of the 800 lived on. The reality of 423 men who defied an army for 4 days became legend. The final hours of the defense were the hardest. By the morning of November 1st, the warehouse was a shell of smoke and shattered concrete. Japanese artillery had cracked the lower walls, fires burned on several floors, and ammunition was down to the last few magazines. The men fought on snipers still picked off officers across the creek. Machine guns answered every assault, but exhaustion had set in. Wounded lay on the upper stories, some too weak to move. Xie Jinyuan walked the corridors one last time, checking each position, speaking quietly to his soldiers. He told them the main army had escaped, their stand had worked. The retreat order from Chiang Kai-shek arrived that afternoon, crossed Suzhou Creek into the international settlement at nightfall. At 10 p.m., the withdrawal began. Small groups moved out the rear doors, crawling through rubble to the creek bank. The water was cold and deep, but the night was thick with fog and the glow of distant fires. Some men waded, others swam, supporting wounded comrades on makeshift rafts of wood and canvas. Japanese patrols fired sporadically, but the darkness and smoke hid most of the movement. Foreign observers on the south bank, journalists, diplomats, civilians watched through binoculars and heard the splashes. One by one, the defenders reached the opposite shore. British and American troops in the settlement helped pull them in, wrapping them in blankets, offering water. By dawn, 423 men had crossed minus a handful who stayed behind to cover the escape or were too wounded to move. The warehouse stood empty, Chinese flags still flying, but silent. Xie Jinyuan was among the last to cross. He refused to leave until every able man was safe. Once in the settlement, the survivors were interned by the foreign powers as disarmed combatants. The Japanese demanded extradition. The settlement refused. The defenders became celebrities. Overnight, crowds gathered outside the camp, cheering them as heroes. Xie himself was lionized in the foreign press as the commander of the 800, but freedom was short. On April 24, 1941, after the Japanese occupied the settlement, Xie was assassinated by a pro-Japanese agent while walking in the camp. He was 37. His men carried his body through the streets in mourning. The defense became one of China's most powerful wartime legends. The 800 heroes story was broadcast nationwide, boosting morale when defeat seemed inevitable. It inspired songs, plays, and later films, including the 2020 movie, The 800. Monuments were built in Shanghai and Taiwan, and the warehouse itself was preserved as a museum. for a nation facing invasion. The image of 423 men holding a warehouse against an army for 4 days became proof that China could resist. The numbers were exaggerated, but the courage was not. The stand at Sihang showed the world, and the Chinese people, that even in retreat, defiance could look like victory.